In this video we look at friction shock absorbers and how they work. I explain my setup and we change the friction material I use. Stick around. Halford Oaks, my name is Div. Welcome to Rad Rods for Africa, a small one-man shop in the middle of a forest where I realize rusty dreams. Today, big shout out to Aubrey Jonker, who asked I make a video about friction shocks. This is for you, meneer. So let's just quickly look at friction shocks. It's very old technology. It was invented before the 1900s already, long time ago. The most common pattern was known as the Andre Hartford pattern. See the picture that I'm showing you? And then it was used until the sort of 1930s, after which it became obsolete and was replaced by hydraulic shocks and then eventually gas shocks. This photo shows the friction shock on a 1923 Aston Martin. Quite a long time ago. So at the very top you can see where it's attached to the chassis, which would be the stationary point. At the bottom it's attached to the front axle, which will obviously move up and down as the car drives over bumps in the road. The friction caused by the friction material in those discs is what creates the damping action and then acts as the shock absorber. So it's obviously not as efficient as the modern shock absorbers. Still fun to do, safe enough. The downfall is essentially only at high speeds because the damping rate cannot change with higher suspension forces. And you know what, it was very noticeable when I towed the car to the car show. When we were exceeding 100 kilometers per hour and I could watch the wheels, then wheel up started becoming noticeable. The concept of a friction shock is quite simple. Let's assume this part is attached to the chassis, so it can't move, and this bar is attached to suspension. So as the suspension moves up and down, we will get that motion. At the moment it's free. If we measure the force required to move it up and down, it's only about 100 grams roughly. If I tighten this nut, what happens? I'm creating friction between the link and this piece. Between these two pieces there's now friction created. To move this up and down will now require more force. You can see it's about 200 grams. Tighten it even more, and now we get as much as 500 to move it up and down. So the tighter I have this, the more friction I create between these two surfaces, the more force is required to move this link up and down. So the friction creates the damping force that's required to keep the wheel on the road and damp out that suspension movement. Undo the nut, very little friction, and it falls. Tighten up the nut, it stays, and the more I tighten it, the more friction I create, the harder to move up and down, or the more force required to move it up and down. The amount of friction I get will depend on two factors. Number one, how tight is this nut? Number two, what material sits between these two surfaces? In my little experiment, the friction created is caused by the properties of, in this case, aluminium, or aluminum as they say in the States. And the tighter I make the nut, the more friction I get. What will happen if I stick a piece of shiny plastic in here? The friction properties will be different, as opposed to putting in a piece of rubber, for instance. So the type of material we use between these two surfaces will affect the friction that we get. The main disadvantage of friction shocks is that the damping rate caused by the friction cannot change when suspension forces increase. For instance, if I'm driving down a road and I should hit a pothole, this force increases, but the damping rate does not change. It remains the same because it's provided or created by the friction force. This is why friction shocks became obsolete and they were replaced by hydraulic shocks and later on gas shocks. Another concept is called stiction. It's to do with this friction business here. The ability of the friction material to maintain its friction. Depending on the type of material, that ability can change over time, which means the damping force will reduce. So let me see if I can explain what's going on here. This is the front axle. It's attached to this point. It's a swivel point here. This goes down, and this is attached to the car, the chassis, and in between here and the chassis is friction material. So when the axle moves up, it moves this, it pushes that away, this wants to move that away, and that force is being resisted by the friction that is created by what is currently rubber. Here's a close-up. This lever is the one that wants to move. When the axle moves up and down, in between there and the back is rubber. So the rubber creates the friction. The tighter I make this nut, the more friction I will create, the harder it will be to move this lever. I've undone the bolt that connects this to the axle. So it's not attached anymore. So what's going to happen? Just to demonstrate, if this axle moves up, this is going to push that way. And it does that. So it's hard to do it at the moment because of the friction that's created here. If I undo this a little bit, let me just take off the lock nut in the back. Undo it a bit. Let's see. Easier. Even more. And now it's very easy. So there's no friction now. And as I tighten this, it becomes harder. I need more friction. I need more force to move it now. That's the concept. Credit for the girly leg design goes to Steve Darnell from Welder Up in Las Vegas. I saw it on one of his videos. Thank you, meneer. Much appreciated. I was fascinated by the concept. In his design, the legs, this is one piece. There's not a swivel point here at that point. So his legs is one solid piece. And when I looked at it, something bothered me about the geometry. So I thought I would first build a little model to understand it better. Let me show you. So here's the quick model I made just from some pieces of hardboard. My two girly legs, they move around a swivel point there. This is then the point where it's attached to the car, and this simulates my front axle. So this will obviously now attached here. Oh, come on. One there and one there. There we go. So obviously my axle moves. This kind of movement, no problem. However, there's a problem here. If I want to move directly this way, my legs are bending. It does not work. You can see, I don't know if you can see on how they lift. I cannot push this way. I am starting to run into problems here. So I need a swivel point here to make this work. A straight vertical axle movement, I'm getting flex in my two legs. Sideways movement, no problem. So I've replaced the legs with something exactly the same, but I've provided a swivel point here. These swivel points are just with some nails. So these ones solid, these ones can swivel here. Now let's look at what the axle can do. Sideways, no problem. Up and down, no problem. Now it's sweet. So I then based my build on this model and created additional swivel points right here. What I want to change today to refine my shock absorbers is the type of friction material that I'm using in here. I've got some rubber, but they are not performing as I want. So I'm just going to take this apart so you can see what's going on here. There we go. So there's my rubber. This is creating my friction. This is the steel plate welded to the chassis. You can see that the paint is wearing off here as the friction material is working against it, but the rubber is not what I want. It's not the right material. So I want to replace this with leather. I think leather will work better. Here's a more close-up shot. I'm just going to take the other leg off as well. And then you can see exactly what goes on behind them. And move this out of the way. Like my rubber material. There you can see this is the plate. This is welded onto the chassis. I've got it tapped and threaded in there for my bolt that goes through. That can screw in there. And then I can lock it from behind with a nut to keep it in place. The tighter I turn this bolt here, the more friction I will get in there. Another improvement would be to create two friction bearing surfaces, because currently it's actually only there. If we can imagine this to be a steel plate, that will go through there, into there. Now I can put friction material there and there. I'll have two friction bearing surfaces, will increase my friction. One important thing though, this steel plate would need to be welded to the bolt so that it remains stationary. Let me just screw it in a little bit. When this moves, so you can imagine friction material in there, friction material in there, this remains stationary, that's stationary, and I've got double the friction. So I've got these leather discs from some stiff leather I had lying around. This leather is about 4 millimeters thick, a little bit more. So I'm going to use this now to replace the rubber I had. Rubber is really too soft. I think it compresses too much. I don't think it's working well enough. So let's replace it with this. And then we're going to see how we go. I believe that some of the old cars even used wood as a friction material. Interesting, eh? I understand it was mostly oak. So if this doesn't work satisfactorily enough, I could even try oak. I've got some, make some oak wooden discs, put them in. There we go. My leather is now in. I'm just gonna tighten it up a little bit. I can just get a feel for it. Yes, I like this. That's nice. So I'm going to try the leather. We'll drive the car a little bit, see how it performs, and then we will reevaluate. Okay, I'm going to do the other one. That goes in there. This copper disc I've got, that's just purely decorative. It's not needed. It could just be a washer as well. Get this line up. Come on. Right, so now it's just a question of getting it in the hole. Come on. There we go. Okay, done. So I will experiment a little bit with how tight these bolts should be. That'll take some testing, I suppose, but yes, I think that's going to work a lot better than the rubber I had. I suppose using a torque wrench to make them the same is not a bad idea. As to what exactly the value should be, I guess that's anybody's guess. It's going to have to be a question of, or a matter of, try and see. I've got some lock nuts on the back. Remember the bolts is going through that thick, what is that, 6mm plate, if not more, 8mm. That is tapped, so there's thread there. So the lock nut is merely there to lock it in place to prevent this bolt from coming undone. So to adjust the tension, I have to undo the lock nut, then I can turn my bolt back a little bit to reduce the pressure or then the friction. Okay, I've just got reattached my lady leg to the front axle. Maybe I'll just show you here. You can see this is made from 6mm plate. I did weld the bush in here to get a little bit more surface area for that swivel point. And this is tapped into a piece of 10mm plate that's welded onto the front axle. I can tighten it to what I feel is good to give a little bit of slack for the movement, and then lock it with a nylock nut. Something like that, maybe a little too loose. I think I can just tighten it a little bit more. I think that's good. Lock it off. There we go. Voila. Okay, cool. The new friction material is in place. We're going to see how that goes. Hey, listen, I really hope I have given you some insight into friction shocks and how they work and what my setup is. If there's any questions, please let me know in the comments. I'll gladly answer them. Yes, let me tell you a quick little story. I was talking to an older gentleman the other day and I asked him if he subscribed to my channel because we were talking about cars and rods and so on. And he said to me, yes, he doesn't know because he doesn't know how much it costs and he's going to get charged for it, so he hasn't subscribed. So listen, it's free. It's going to be free all year. If you find any value in my channel, I would appreciate if you hit the subscribe button. It means a lot to me. Thanks for watching, Oz. I'll catch you on the next one.